everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to our session on new towns, making infrastructure real and new developments less car dependent. I'm Jane Beckett. I'm a Planning Associate Director with Stantec. I've got lots of experience with planning and shaping new communities, and we've got a wonderful panel with us today to unpick this topic, but I'll come to introductions in a minute. The government have set a very ambitious target of achieving 1.5 million homes. And new towns are very much at the forefront of that, a mechanism to provide, accelerate and deliver these homes set by government. I think as we start to plan this new generation of new towns, this presents a really rare opportunity that we can start trying to change habits and not just focus on the delivery of building houses, but also look at the kind of how we live as a community, how we go about our daily routine. But obviously that comes with a very big challenge. And ultimately, we need to make sure that putting infrastructure first isn't just a concept. It actually becomes a reality. So as we all know, like when we start designing places around cars, it's really hard to change that pattern, really hard to adapt moving forward. But what we need to do that is flip that on its head. We need to actually make sure it isn't just a concept. We are actually aligning and providing that infrastructure first. So today we'll be exploring kind of the designing infrastructure first in, how we deliver that, a bit on funding, and what needs to happen moving forward. So we've got a great panel with us today. We've got policy, government, developer, all aspects to try and unpick this topic. So I'll let you all introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about yourselves. Helen, do you want to go first?
I can do. Hello, everybody. I'm Helen Elton. I'm Head of Transport Policy at West Yorkshire Combined Authority. So I lead from our full local transport plan, and we are taking our local transport plan to adoption at our combined authority next week, fingers crossed. So from that position, I also then lead the team to develop the future pipelines of investment, if you like, from both capital and revenue, and our programmes for delivery. So we're currently in the process of moving to our integrated settlement from April and developing our delivery plans for thereafter. So we have about a £6 billion pipeline of investment for West Yorkshire, for which about £2.5 billion of that is for mass transit. But aside from that, a full programme of capital investment across all modes, including from rail through to bus and through to active travel. I should just say also, we are moving towards bus franchising to start operating services from April next year. So this particular conversation for me is around how we do that join up and get that full kind of linkage between the bus network and where infrastructure is prioritised.
Brilliant. Jo?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jane. I'm Jo Neville. I'm National Director of Planning for a company called Harworth Group. I don't recognise a lot of people in the room, so I'll just give you a very short intro about what Harworth Group do. So we are a regenerator of land, a master developer, a land trader. We operate across 3 regions predominantly, so Yorkshire, the North West, the Midlands. We go as far north as probably Throckley and Newcastle, as far south as Bedford, as far east as Grimsby, and as far west as Wrexham. Within that massive geography, we control about 30,000 residential plots. 46% of those are either consented or somewhere in the wonderful planning system. And then we also have a very large industrial and logistics portfolio. So we have about 35 million square feet of I&L. 75% of that is either consented or somewhere in the system. So that can show you the planning journey that employment sites take compared to resi. It's much tougher for resi. We don't have any new towns, but we do have some big bangers in that sort of mix. So our sweet spot is probably anything of about 2,000 homes, all the way up to, at the minute, we're in planning for 4,500. So I'm not talking from a new towns perspective, well, sat here today yet. We'd probably like to get our hands on one. So please send details through. Okay.
Hiya, my name's Graham. I'm part of the team at Active Travel England. Active Travel England are a statutory consultee and a planning system in development management at the moment, but it is proposed that we take on a similar role in spatial development strategies. We offer a limited pre-app service at the minute as well. Another main part of what Active Travel England do, or has done until very recently, is that we're government's funder of active travel schemes, although with devolution that's obviously changing, and integrated settlements, I think Helen was talking about in a different room earlier on. So we work with colleagues across the country to make sure that we get the most value from active travel investment. Before joining Active Travel England, I spent my career working in local authority or regional authority, previously running a local highways department and lead local flood authority, so I'm used to, the intricacies of engaging in the planning system.
Brilliant, thank you all. I think before we get started, we'd like to know who we're talking to today. So could I have a quick show of hands whether you are in the public sector? Brilliant. And the private sector? Okay, we've got a mixed bag, okay? Brilliant. So we all know that, designing infrastructure it has to be done really early doors. I think, in Leeds we've got, there's the new towns that have been announced. Leeds has got one of them from the task force, that's Leeds South Bank. But I think what we'll be talking today, yes, it relates to new towns, but it also relates to new settlements, the small, not necessarily 10,000 plus, it's any new community and settlement. So, Helen, if I come to you first, we know that infrastructure has to be done really early doors. And from a policy perspective, how do you ensure that be it new towns, Leeds South Bank, or, new settlements, urban extensions, really kind of integrate into your existing infrastructure in terms of your regional priorities, but also site-specific infrastructure? We're talking, obviously, travel, transport infrastructure. We know there's other infrastructure we could go down a rabbit hole with for new towns. But how best do you see policy integrating that in?
I think it's a really interesting question, actually, because a lot of our funding, but a lot of our policy priorities are to make more of what we already have. So our policy frameworks are very much geared to increasing bus patronage, increasing use of sustainable modes, and therefore not spending money to add to distance of road network, for example. It's about repurposing what our transport networks do. Can we create, more space for bus priority? Can we create more space for walking and cycling within that existing network? So being able to kind of do, as you say, a new towns or new kind of areas that are outside of current urban areas. It's about how do we enable that infrastructure to still build on and deliver according to what we're doing. So I would say from our perspective, it's not about looking at the infrastructure alone. It's about looking at how that delivers alongside a service offer, because if you just build the infrastructure, how do you then get people to use it in the way you want them to use it? So there's about a joining up of a system here to do that.
And the mechanisms to do that, are we talking early doors, getting it into strategic policy, making sure these kind of new areas for growth or new town settlements are put in policy early doors, or we need some mechanisms to make sure that follows through into the planning system?
Absolutely, and I think the current kind of shift, if you like, with government through devolution and the opportunities that brings, and joining up policy areas, particularly through the requirement for local growth plans, for example, allow us to do that much stronger. So, as we've just been saying, our integrated settlements allow us to pool our funding, which is one part of the mechanism, but it's about having the strategic policy in place to do that as well. So setting your spatial development plan, setting your local growth plan all help to drive to drive through there.
Graham, coming to you. In terms of obviously Active Travel England, you know, you're consultee, but you also set guidance, best practice. Like, what is the best practice? You know, what is currently how you see best practice coming through? Is it early engagement with developers? You know, obviously there's standards. We need adaptability for our schemes.
There's a lot to unpick there.
I know.
I'm going to start by telling you about something that some developers have talked to me about, like putting it from their perspective. I'm not going to name who they are, but one of the developers was talking to me and saying, look, we really want to deliver infrastructure first. We really want to deliver high-quality places to live, and so on. But because it's not standards, and certain things aren't standards, then it all becomes a debate between us and the local authority. Viability comes into it. And also, we potentially get outbid for the land. Because if it's standards, then everybody's going to deliver the same kind of quality of infrastructure. And then, you know, that comes off the conversation in terms of the land price. And therefore, we've baked it into our assumptions right from the off. The absence of certain things as standards means that they are, you know, because they're not standards, it means that people have to opt into doing it. And the problem that they have is that a lot of the time the site is determined by the time that they've purchased it, because then they know how much money they've got to spend on it. Within that context, and recognizing that certain things, particularly with highways, are standards, like the design manual for roads and bridges, which for those of you who are aware is focused much more on kind of higher speed highways, but they're the only standards nationally. Things like manual for streets are guidance, not standards. Although they are referenced in the National Planning Policy Framework, we might want to come back to that. What it means is that certain requirements in terms of walking, wheeling, cycling, public transport and other things aren't necessarily designed in from the off, and they are more optional than other people would consider that they should be. Thinking of the opportunities now in terms of what's about to happen, obviously the change to mayoral combined authorities, the fact that there's the integrated settlements, there is a neat little thing there that, you know, mayoral combined authorities could determine that in part of their grant agreements, they say to all local highway authorities, we're not going to give you any funding unless you adhere to certain things, like conditions in terms of highway standards. At the moment, what the situation is it says that local highway authorities will be responsible for local highway standards, but mayors are encouraged to align them wherever possible. And they have the opportunity to do that in the coming years. And one of the things that we're doing from Active Travel England's perspective is working with DFT to review manual for streets so that that could become a baseline, and that if local highway authorities and mayoral combined authorities want to go further, that they can. But that could, essentially one of the things to think about there is that you only have to have a limited number of conversations with mayors, and they could then embed the same baseline of standards across the country through their spatial development plans, and then that would become standards. Then it's about trying to work with local authorities and councillors to make them understand what they can fight for and push for, so that it is considered as a standard, and you don't have this conversation about, well, we'll take our investment elsewhere because we won't have to invest as much.
We'll come on to adaptability in a minute, but Joe, from a developer's point of view, in terms of what kind of, going back to basics, how do you as a developer ensure infrastructure is put in place early doors?
I mean, helpfully, I'm not going to disagree with what these guys have just said. So from Graham's perspective, I absolutely agree. If it's standard, then, you know, you've got to do it. But where you've just come from about what's your starting point, and it's location, location, location. If we've got an edge of settlement, big site, and there's a train station there, it is so much easier because we're only worried about what's happening within the boundary then, and we can sensibly master plan it. You know, we use good master planners, and we'll come up with a scheme, because at the end of the day, we want to create something where people can easily get around and also want to live there, and it's not, you know, dominated by car. But if you are about a more isolated site that is relying on some big piece of chunky infrastructure, which that development can't stand, and we've got quite a few of these, you know, they're just stalled. We've got one at the minute in, I don't know if there's anyone here from Chesterfield, and it's hinging on a relief road, this scheme, that's just had its 100-year anniversary. And it's been a priority of the local authority for that much time. It's been sat with DFT for an absolute age, and it can't get funding because it's just not meeting value for money in business case terms. There's 1,500 homes just sat there waiting for that. But we can't, and speaking really openly, we can't get into a sensible conversation with the local authority about doing something different. You know, you could spend 200 million on something else really different because it is enshrined in policy. So there's loads of challenges, but it just depends on where your site is. If it's like the South Bank in Leeds, it's got excellent existing connections. If it's a bit more remote, like some of the new towns are, they're going to take a hell of a lot of pump priming, and I'm not sure the development themselves can withstand it.
So if we are looking at those isolated new towns, we're looking at the infrastructure, first for these big new settlements. What level of infrastructure first is proportionate then, from a developer's point of view? You need, obviously, there's the battle between critical mass to use bus services, train services, and it's getting that critical mass, but also putting that infrastructure in place early doors. Like, what do you think needs to be there?
I don't think it's something that like Harworth or other developers can solve. It's incumbent on everyone in this room, so it's public and private sector together. We try and have a really sensible conversation at the outset with combined authorities and local authorities about how we phase things sensibly. The important thing is that we get a permission that is flexible, and it's not a permission that's a prophecy, because we don't know what will happen. Sites of 2,000 plus homes take 10 years to come forward, minimum. And we don't know all the changes that will happen. So we might design something today, which is, standard, but then we all move on, don't we? And then that standard changes, and we need to be able to be alive to it. What we have seen, it's really hard to put all the infrastructure in day one. Those schemes can't stand it. I think typically a scheme of 2,000 units, the Section 106 is about 60 grand a plot. If you compare that to infill development, that's about 20 grand. That's a huge hike that development needs to, withstand. And it might be able to in some parts of the country. In some parts, it just can't. And that's why there's a conversation with all of us in the room to make sure people aren't living on little islands while things drip in over 10 years.
We'll come on to partnerships and funding shortly, but in terms of from a kind of West Yorkshire Combined Authority, what would you say, what infrastructure do you feel needs to be in place to be occupation ready? That first person moves in, what needs to be there?
I think they need to have the right options available to them. So just providing a road means that you've then got a situation where the only way to move around is by using a car, I think. But it's about making sure it's got good pedestrian links. There's good space for walking. There's routes for cycling are being considered. There's not just one way in and out of an estate. It's about those connections to people can actually access. But also, if we are in for the long game, then how can we make sure that they are baked into a bus network, that it might not wash its face from day one, but in a different world, and that's where moving to franchising is quite important in this. Being able to wash its face from day one isn't maybe necessarily the aim, but knowing that it will have patronage over time and you can build that in from the start, seeing a bus at least operating through an area is really important for people to know that actually that might be an alternative to just driving. So I think it's about visible options in front of them.
Would you see that through like pump priming services with developer or partnerships?
There's a multiple way of doing that, and I think partnerships, but also kind of different ways for us and the private sector, to work together to bring that funding through. But different models of delivering bus services, and that's why franchising is the model that is being moved to progressively, allows for slightly different conversations to happen.
Brilliant. Obviously, Jo has discussed about adaptability and standards and things. Obviously, there are, as you say, there's different levels of standards, guidance and things. Is there any good examples we've had of temporary infrastructure being put in place? And what adaptability is key ultimately. We've seen new towns be planned, or settlements being planned over, they take decades to build. And then we see changing design guidance on infrastructure, road, LTN 120, that's, played a big part recently on having to retrofit, cycling and pedestrian access in. Like, Graham, in terms of pedestrian and cycle routes, have you seen some good examples of putting temporary in, what and how they can adapt to become full standards in due course?
None that would come to mind now. I think actually colleague Stephen Joseph, who's there at the moment, might not want to speak to it himself, but a huge amount of work's been done on good examples and bad examples. And I guess that there's more bad examples in this country of infrastructure or lack of infrastructure first.
We have got a roaming mic if you would like to.
Well, we might come back to that. One of the things that I would note, though, and thinking about infrastructure first, is it's not just about walking, wheeling and cycling routes by any stretch of the imagination. It's about making sure that there is a reason to be there anyway. So thinking about temporary things and thinking about case studies. There is a site in Newcastle called Newcastle Great Park. Huge, loads and loads of houses there. I think that the first Section 106 agreement was signed in around the year 2000. The supermarket opened in the last 2 years. And so when you're thinking about the level of infrastructure that's going into these places and why it's there, I think one of the things that people could think about in terms of opportunities as we look forward into new areas is thinking about, well, what services are we lacking in these urban areas that we're building extensions to and so on? Like, if we're lacking nursery places, if we're lacking primary school places, if we're facing struggles in terms of recognizing that we need to update certain types of buildings, why not think about temporary uses on those sites that actually get people using it in the first place? Particularly when it comes to bus services and things like that, it costs a huge amount of money to pump prime bus services when people aren't going to be using them. If people start using the bus to get out to that site in the first place, for whatever reason it might be, like employment or nursery or something like that, and then coming back in again, it would help to actually undermine or underpin the type of investment that you might need. And just thinking about things slightly differently in that way, so thinking about temporary uses that you're lacking at the moment and putting it at the other end of the transport corridor. And I'll leave it there, but happy to to come back to it in terms of temporary uses.
So we're saying, obviously, we're focusing on kind of transport infrastructure, cycling, walking, public transport infrastructure. But I guess what you're saying, Graham, is obviously we need services, we need local centres, we need employment and services there to bring people to these new towns early doors before, at the same time as the first phases, because then obviously it comes on to phasing of infrastructure then, doesn't it?
You've got to be pragmatic about all of these things, but I think most of us in this room, for those who've come in slightly later than others, it's about half and half between private sector and public sector in this room. So everybody will have their own view of different things. But sometimes, if you wait too late to put a bus service in, then people are going to be driving, and once they've already embedded that habit, then it's there. We all know that the first, say, 3-4 weeks of somebody living in a new house is when they form their new behaviours. So you're going to lose a lot of different householders to car use if you don't have alternatives designed around them. So I guess part of it is thinking about how you can hinge the number of houses that should be occupied at a certain point in time. But there's various other things. And yeah, I think just a recognition that infrastructure, clearly the first infrastructure that you put in is your roads, because you need to be able to bring in your goods that you're going to be building with, but then making sure you've actually got a network of other things. And as for those temporary uses, for example, thinking about open space, thinking about parks, some of these things that there is a real shortage of in other areas would actually bring more people to coming to that urban extension in advance of there being homes there and start to picture themselves potentially living there.
Yeah. So there's obviously quite not a contradiction, but fairly in planning policy, design guidance at the moment versus parking versus active travel. We have to, there are very, be it what authority you're dealing with, there are maximum minimum parking standards per dwelling, per any use. How do we start looking at to help change policy, to help make that guidance depending on, what type of, I guess it needs that balance. How can you see that moving forward in terms of policy change? Helen, do you want to come first, or Joe, have you got any opinion?
I've got a great example, actually,
Go on
which gives other people a chance to kind of... Marmalade Lane in Cambridge. Some other colleagues here will know about it, but one of the things that's really interesting about that is that there's 2 housing sites right next door to each other of exactly the same square meterage.
Yeah.
Now, Marmalade Lane is built around a co-housing principle whereby everybody has their own homes, but they share certain types of spaces, so it's effectively a pedestrianised street that runs through it. They've got shared garden. The amount of space on that site that is given over to road infrastructure and car parking while still meeting the same kind of standards is so much smaller than on the site next door. And so you can fit more homes in, and you can fit more green space in, and you can do things slightly differently if you recognise that you don't always have to have a drive in front of you. That said, you know, it's certain people who want to live in certain different types of housing. And I think if everybody was demanding the idea that actually you had more types of space, then house builders wouldn't be building in certain ways. You know, they're delivering for a market. But there is a recognition that you can flex and change things. And I just think that's I don't have the percentages to mind, but it's a really interesting way of looking at two exactly the same parcels of space and looking at the difference in terms of grey space, really, that's been afforded to it.
I guess it's changing habit, like I was saying, in terms of we need to change the habit of having our car right outside our front door. Obviously, we need to get into the pattern of either, you know, you walk to a bus stop, you walk to your car, whether it is. And I know, obviously, there's a development on one of your sites, Joe, Waverley, a new community in Rotherham, where they've based it on the Marmalade Lane principles, which is just next to your local centre, Olive Lane. It's development by Forge New Homes, where they've got a central car park and everything is public realm other than that, and the housing is developed within public realm as opposed to having private drives. And it's not occupied yet, but it's looking really good. So hopefully, you know, those principles are coming through design codes and principles. Helen, have you got anything to add, Joe?
I was just going to say, we deal with a lot of authorities that are two-tier authorities. And when we get the district's buy-in to create this, you know, we've had one recently, we submitted a reserve matter, say 180 homes. By the time we've gone with the county and we've gone through the parking standards, we're down at like 156 because, you know, every time you get a 4-bed, there's got to be 3 parking spaces on the front. And it's just a battle that is, you know, we've argued it for a year, and then in the end you just concede because at the end of the day you need permission. So we've got a long way to go. I agree with what Graham said, but in reality, it's not happening yet. It is in some places, but it's not across the board. And it's how long you wait, because every time you have a delay, it's just cost, isn't it? And uncertainty.
I think this comes back to, you know, national government's approach, but also how they then, you know, deliver that through the policy frameworks that are, you know, put in place through the local areas, and then how that comes through. And there's a mindset change needed, but there is also a structural change that whether we're on a journey for it, I'm not sure, but those two things need to line up to really get the actual change on the ground for delivery.
Do you think the new spatial development strategies coming through could help?
That's what I'm referring to. I think yes, if they're done with the strength of policy that we're sort of talking about here and done in the right way, that's why I think they're on a bit of a journey to do that. Yeah. And I think it'll only be proof when they start to actually form. It's probably too early to say, I think, is what I'm saying at the moment with that strength of change.
There is a chance to, though, and I think that's the thing that we have to really think about. There is a proper chance to change and there aren't that many mayors, there's not that many conversations that can be had, and there's strength in numbers that if they do it together, then it becomes much more consistent, and you're representing huge proportions and percentages of the people, of the populace of the country. And that's basically what makes it a standard, because if you need to do it in all of these different areas, you're going to start doing it everywhere. Bit of a workaround, I appreciate that, but there is a real chance. And also with things like Manual for Streets and other such things, there is a moment whereby you can do it. For those of you in the room who remember Manual for Streets coming out, a huge amount of it still applies, but people don't necessarily apply it. And part of the issue with that is, really good piece of advice, wasn't necessarily acted on. Developers might come forward with proposals. Local highway authorities weren't ready to actually adopt or accept them, and there you lose the momentum and people revert back to type. And that's why we've got a situation with the RTPI, noting the amount of car-dependent, you know, developments that we've seen. But there is a chance for us all to change, and everybody in this room, be it public or private, will have a role to play in that. And we can actually sign up to a new way of doing things and do it together. With a new Manual for Streets and other such things acting as that kind of that catalyst and that moment to be like, right, we're going to do things slightly differently now.
So do we think then, in terms of looking at governance going forward and how we can make change happen, do we see it happening through spatial development strategies and development corporation areas to begin with, as kind of not test cases, but places that can be delivered slightly differently to the norm through their own certain policies, or how do we see it happening from top down? You know, how do we make this change and change of habits moving forward?
I think there's a bit of everything, and I think there's a bit of there almost needs to be some leadership and some strength of kind of leadership in terms of how that can happen to kind of push through certain decisions, because it is a mindset change, and unless, you know, there's evidence that people are going to buy into some of this, it's going to be a challenge. But there's no reason why it can't happen, and that's why I think it does come back to the strength of leadership. So you start to then look at the mayoral areas in terms of pushing through that kind of approach over some of the, you know, the most densely populated areas in the country.
Jo, have you got?
For me, a spatial development strategy is there's a new layer of planning. So it's going to give us a 20-year vision for an area. It's not going to, you know, get bogged down by site-specific allocations. So that, coupled with national development management policies in the new NPPF, you know, when it's in June, it'll let local authorities and local plans focus on site specifics, and then all of this can come through in site-specific allocations. You won't have to replicate everything that's said at a national level, but we can probably get better quality site-specific policies. And just picking up on the point that Graham made, and it was the broader infrastructure first point, and it's something we grapple with all the time, and Jane's working on one of our big sites. And it's, when do you deliver the school? When do you deliver the local centre? Because we would absolutely love to put it all up on day one. And in a lot of these authorities, we've got great relationships with our councils and our planning officers. And it's about having a sensible conversation. And sometimes we deliver the school too early at the request of the LPA. And then we're absolutely hammered when it fills up with kids from outside the settlement and their siblings. And then there's no space because the people who bought houses then can't go there. And similarly, we'll try our best to deliver a local centre early, because why wouldn't we? It'll help push values for us. But no one wants to go there until there's a certain critical mass living on site. So a lot of it is chicken and egg, and it's just about having the most flexible policy that we can, and all being pragmatic about what we're trying to deliver, because no one wants to really create a ghost local centre, you know, that fills up with shops that you don't want. And when it's delivered at the right time, it creates the best local centre, because you can be really choosy about the occupiers because you've got such high demand.
Then to the elephant in the room, funding and viability. Not so much elephant, it's just matter of fact. Obviously, the government have put, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on infrastructure, as you say, the NPPF change, you know, focusing on development around train stations. Obviously, that is a massive step in, you know, presumption of around infrastructure. There's also the infrastructure delivery fund, obviously, that's increased. Homes England have got their own more powers now to provide funding and help with delivery options. I guess, what has been done well so far in terms of like what actual funding makes a difference to help that infrastructure first? Jo, you must have come across it in your developments. Like, what funding pots have you used to really help accelerate infrastructure?
We've tended to use our own balance sheet, really. We either own the site, so Harworth was born out of UK Coal, so we inherited a lot of former UK Coal assets. They tend to be very edge of settlement, so we've had a lot of work to do in the ground. We're also doing partnership structures where we will put our own balance sheet in to service sites. But the biggest lever for us that helps enable a site is getting the right planning permission. More recently, we've looked at a lot of sites where landowners have wanted to promote it themselves, you know, understandably so, and they've gone so far and they've got permission, and we've had to, and because they've never delivered before, we've had to come in and rejig that permission so that we can phase it just to make it viable, because we're not awash with public money. You know, if you submit sites into the New Homes Accelerator, there's no money knocking about. It's just about powers and resourcing. So really, it's working with the realms of the planning system to make your Section 106 agreement and your triggers sensible and flexible to respond to market requirements.
Thanks. Obviously, there are various pots available. You know, Helen, I know we can't speak in detail or anything, but you've secured a lot of funding for your mass transit system in, you know, West Yorkshire, and obviously you've got insights across boundary authorities. how do you help that funding stream to enable development to come forward in terms of linking that into your
Yes.
strategies?
So as a devolved mayoral combined authority, we are moving towards our integrated settlement, but it also means that we have had, over the last few years, our 5-year long-term capital funding and continuing that through our new Transport for City Regions programme. So it's that funding, so it's part of our integrated settlement, but it's that capital funding that Mass Transit has been aligned to, as has all of our other capital, needing to deliver our other capital infrastructure across buying new buses, refurbishing or building new bus stations or bus priority or active travel. It's all within that same pot. What I'm trying to say is our size of our pipeline, we have about a £6 billion pipeline, there is not enough money to fund all of that. And I'm not saying that £6 billion needs funding delivering over the next 5 years, but it's about that, long-term programme for this. Therefore, we obviously have to prioritise where we spend in our TCR amount of 2.1 billion. We have to prioritise where we spend our capital money and take decisions on that basis. So we would be looking, and government expect us to look for local contributions or other funding to match our funding. So it's about how can we then join together those funding pots to get that bigger outcome and deliver those benefits across all. So I think particularly locations where you've got significant development coming forward, it's how can we therefore work together to deliver that infrastructure. And mass transit's a great example because so the scheme for mass transit that we're working on as a programme is delivering a change in public transport offer within our most densely populated part of West Yorkshire. So in theory, the economic benefit that gives and the land value uplift that gives you a wider opportunity for funding and finance. That means that we can hopefully deliver a scheme that's not totally funded by government money.
Brilliant. And obviously Leeds, as an example, are starting to look at strategic options based around the mass transit system. So obviously you can see that how it will follow through
Yes.
planning policy thereafter. And then in terms of active travel and linking that to funding, obviously through travel planning, in Section 106 obviously there are kind of trigger-based requirements on success. Do we see that still as a mechanism to move forward to make sure developers achieve more funding the more success they have with their active travel? Do you see that still working?
Section 106 is obviously critical, and it's much more. I mean, one of the things that I had working in a local authority is people would think about things like community infrastructure levy, as you then had, and that's needed for other things. It's never going to go to walking and cycling, frankly, because education is more important in terms of being able to manage the kind of the gap in funding and so on. Picking up on Helen's point, though, is that bearing in mind what we talked about and trying to be really positive about new towns and so on, we can learn lessons from the past. And we can reset relationships and we can do things slightly differently if we want to. We all can, because we're humans and we can learn, And within this context, the importance of relationships and trust is so critical, because frankly, there would be a situation, if we look at the past 20, 30 years of delivery of capital schemes across the country, generally speaking, in this country, we don't always deliver on time, so we need other options. And if you have a mature relationship between a developer who wants the same outcome, which is the delivery of quality homes and communities within your area, and you've got a mayoral combined authority or other authority who is wanting the same kind of things, then there are always deals to be done, appropriate deals to be done, by varying things like Section 106s and saying, well, actually, we've got the opportunity to fund £2 or £3 million worth to do this type of infrastructure this year, and we'll vary the 106 and mean that you pay then 5 years, 6 years down the line in a different way to do this stuff. And that's how relationships work, isn't it? The same site that I referenced in terms of Great Park, we did that, that kind of thing, whereby there's a recognition we can apply for funding. we'll apply for funding, we'll deliver this requirement based on trigger points and so on and so forth, and they'll amend the Section 106 and they'll deliver something else that it's harder for us to get access to. You know, it's reasonable, it's balanced, and it's based on relationships, and I think we can all actually look to move forward in that way, particularly with new towns, where you're like, the outcome is pretty clear. We want good quality new homes where people choose to live in decent communities.
Yeah, I think it comes back to adaptability again, doesn't it, in terms of we need flexible planning consents to ensure that there's certain measures are in there, but the delivery mechanism may change over time, you know, a decade on. And it's, I think, from our benefit of flexible planning consent is our ways forward. However, obviously that needs to be done in joint consultation with combined authorities, local authorities and governments. So that brings us on to kind of obviously partnership working. I think most people must be in agreement that it's the only way forward to achieve the funding, the cross-body, boundary working that we need to deliver, say, new towns, new settlements. Obviously, you as a combined authority, you must obviously work a lot of partnerships and things. What's worked really well in what, lessons learned from partnerships, what works well, what doesn't?
I think it's having that shared vision and that shared objective. And from our perspective, our strongest working kind of partnership working is with our district partners, and understanding, and our political leaders and all the rest of it, understanding that we are all delivering for the same outcomes and working together is really important. Having that shared vision that we can strive to enables that and enables that to progress. And we've been working really hard on that through a number of different areas we've been delivering across as an organisation. I think where it kind of then starts to fall down is where those priorities don't quite align, and you start to notice some of that if you're trying to achieve different things out of delivering the same money. So how you then carve up funding, you're doing it in a way that we're all clear that it might not be even or a fair share, if you like, between districts, because it's about who's delivering the right outcomes across that and where can we get the greatest value for money in that place.
Jo, have you been involved with many partnerships, worked successfully? Obviously, you liaise with bodies all the time. Like, what works well for you guys?
We've got a number of partnership agreements now with landowners. They want to live the dream as well and come on the journey. And it's about everything Helen just said, but also sharing risk. So we'll invest our balance sheet and our expertise in bringing it forward. But then in the wider partnership, we're not in the habit of investing in locations where people don't want to work with you. It's so welcome when you turn up and a local authority welcomes you or a combined authority welcomes you, wants to engage, wants to deliver a nice place. But that's not everywhere. So we just tend to not go to those areas now because it's hard enough. So we don't need that added layer of complexity, especially in the, back to the funding environment. There's not money just sloshing around for things. And to create genuinely nice places, everybody has to absolutely have bought into that vision and be on that journey. And the point that Graham made is, if you've got that flexibility and there's, say, a 5 million underspend somewhere, you can probably enhance what you were going to do anyway. If there's that sort of ability to rejig your Section 106, etc., around that.
Do you think partnerships need to be kind of made more structured in terms of, does it need to be solidified in terms of a JV's fine, or do we need to go that step further and do development corporations? Like, how do you see that working? Obviously, the government have muted development corporations as a way forward for partnerships to deliver these new towns, and they can obviously set their own kind of structure, requirements, policy guidance. Do you see that as a...
I think it'd make it easier. I mean, we're massively, and I say this all the time, but we're just a nation of NIMBYs. Like, we don't want anyone living anywhere near us, do we? It's fine for us to all live in a house. But I mean, we've submitted planning recently for about 3,500 homes on an allocated site, And already, it's only been in like 2 months, and it's got 1,600 objections. And you read all the objections, and they're about the principle of it. So at least if you have a slightly different planning framework, when we get to committee, that is a brave set of councillors, isn't it, to take that through. And that's what we're always conscious of. And you go to committee, and you actually just roll the dice. So I think if as soon as we move away to development corporations, it just gives you, all of us, a bit more certainty.
Fab. So we'll come to Q&A in a minute if anyone's got any questions. I'll just end with a couple of last questions from me. I think ultimately then, once we've ideally put these design principles in place, design early doors, policy changes, you know, doing it through policy, we're getting in there, we're planning for adaptability. How do we ensure that it's monitored and managed going forward? You know, is it going to be your travel plan measures to tick a box for Section 106? It's like, how do we ensure that car trips don't then get diluted into what we design as best practice going forward? Does anyone want to come?
I think one of the things that we do recognise is that monitoring and evaluation, not just on things like new housing estates, but across the piece, has not been good enough in this country in terms of recognising. But so too, then, the opportunity that's taken in public and private sector to learn from the experiences that you've had. Vast majority of us in this room will finish one thing and get straight on to the next. How often do we genuinely actually sit there and think, right, let's reflect on and learn from the process that we've just been through, which is a core principle of like the investors in people approach. One of the things that we've done as an exec agency, and recognising that in the age of kind of mayoral combined authorities, our role changes, is engaging with them about what they need. And one of the things that they need is better monitoring and evaluation to prove what works. But so does government too, frankly, because at the end of this period, the Secretary of State, the ministers and so on are still going to be pulled in front of the Public Accounts Committee and said, well, what's the value of the public money that you've been giving out? And the response that we've given it to mayors is not going to be sufficient. We're going to need to evidence what has happened with it. So it's a long intro to saying one of the things that we intend to move it much more into is much more proactive monitoring, not only of housing sites, but also working with local authorities and mayoral combined authorities to do consistent monitoring locally, but at a national level as well. And that'll enable us to derive insights and then commission products that actually make things easier for people. Because if you all can't spend the time thinking about reviewing what works and what doesn't, then maybe we should be doing that for you. And that's the different role that government can play as we move forward.
Fab. And then last one, before we come to the audience. What key policy change do you think it needs to happen moving forward?
I think it comes back to some of the things we've been saying and making sure some of these structures are in place. So the spatial development strategies and what we are able to push through there, and you know, how can we make sure that some of those structures are delivered in that, and that leadership to make that happen, but also kind of what has what best practice has happened, what has generated through that monitoring evaluation, as Graham was just saying, is really important as a cycle. So I'd say it's not just about policy levers, but it's about having the structures around them to enable those decisions to come through to delivery.
No more policy changes from my perspective. I mean, we've been messing about with the planning system for years. I think it just needs to bed in now. Everything's going in the right direction.
Stop changing things.
Let's get on the ground and see if it makes a difference. I mean, I have to report internally on planning changes, and I can't keep up. And I'm RTPI, so if I can't, how can everyone else?
Strengthening
minimum housing densities.
I like it. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, my name's Callum. I work for Bristol City Council. I'm an intern. There's some struggle in selling the idea of neighbourhoods that are walkable and easy to cycle around without being able to actually see what that looks like. You can tell them a vision and try and picture it, but until people actually see what these types of communities are like the ones you find in the Netherlands, it's much clearer. Do you see the next generation of new towns that are built specifically around the idea of walkable neighbourhoods and neighbourhoods you can cycle around will aid in selling the vision of adapting existing communities to be easier to walk and cycle around?
Is that to all of us? Or?
Anyone? Everyone?
Well, I think as soon as you can touch it and you can see it, you believe it, don't you? I mean, we're not allowed to talk about 15-minute neighbourhoods anymore, are we? Because it's a huge conspiracy theory around it.
We'll try 20-minute neighbourhoods instead.
But yeah, why wouldn't you? We do a lot of, looking at what other developers have done and what good looks like. And when you walk around places that are great, it's just brilliant, isn't it? So I think people need to touch it and see it really first.
I agree with that, and I think that there's opportunities. There are sites out there that are really good in different parts of the country, and just making sure that you all know where they are, so that you can take people to have a look at them is really important.
It was interesting about the idea of, estate parking rather than like the assumption that every house has its private driveway, because there's a neighborhood in Freiburg in Germany built on an old military base where if you own a car, you have to park it in a parking space outside the sort of housing estate, and it really creates a more walkable, less car-dominated environment. So it's an interesting concept.
It's really interesting in transport how, particularly with car ownership, we haven't moved in the same way that we have in various other things, whereby we often now pay for access as opposed to ownership, but we haven't necessarily done the same thing with transport, have we?
Well, the message isn't consistent either, because you can go to a lot of places and that will be absolute, your highways team and your local authority team will absolutely buy into that vision and see how it can work. And then it is just so polarised, because you could take the exact same thing somewhere else and it's just no, this is what our policy says, and no amount of negotiation can take you on that journey. And then from our perspective, it's so expensive to go to appeal and very unknown that you just think, should we just concede? And we end up just conceding. But if we were braver and tested more things at appeal, then we might see a change faster.
Gentleman. Yes, of course.
Thank you. My name is Peter Wakefield and I come from Cambridge. I'm not a planner, I'm more interested in transport. Cambridge is a place where, of course, there's huge development, and I think there's about 5 new towns of 10,000 homes being built or proposed, plus Tempsford and various other huge developments. Jobs are coming quicker than housing can be produced for them, so we want housing produced at pace. Lots of the new towns which are planned and are being built out have got all the good planning practices we've been talking about and you would like to see from Freiburg and Marmalade Lane and all the rest of it, but they're not being produced quick enough. So is it the best way to get a new town or group of new towns, which will double the population of the town to something near 500,000 in the next 20 odd years, a development corporation? And if so, what does a modern development corporation, in your view, look like? Will it be able to borrow money to build all the infrastructure we know, putting in new railway stations, doubling railway tracks out to new markets and various other places, which will enable the current transport network to do its job properly? So how does a modern development corporation work? There is one proposed, but there's a lot of argument about it, of course. As one of your panelists said, whatever we propose, there's always a lot of people against everything. So, development corporation is seen as not a good thing by many people. So what is a modern development corporation like?
Shall I kick off on this one? I think obviously a development corporation can have a lot of powers. It's how they use those powers moving forward, be that funding, their own policy regulations. You'd hope that in this day and age, they would help to drive, funding is absolutely needed. And I know that through a lot of the new communities and new towns work Stantec's done, Sir Michael Lyons, head of the New Towns Task Force, said these new towns are there to accelerate homes and delivery. Development corporations do take time to set up. There are some have worked really well in the past, so when they're on specific themes and specific journeys. I think, modern day ones, it just depends on the focus. They need a very clear focus and to stick to it, and then to use partnerships within that to sort the funding, to sort the policy regulation of that area. And I think a key focus is absolute critical, and not to have it too widespread. Anyone else?
I would make sure that there is representatives of the end users on the development corporation. I think it's one of the things that we often forget, is making sure that the people who are going to be using the product at the end of it are represented in the planning on the way through. And I think a mature development corporation would definitely make sure that it's got those people, including those who would use things like affordable housing and things like that, as part of its makeup.
Brilliant. We've only got a couple of minutes, so just Matt.
Hi, Adrian from a company called Sweco. I was not going to ask a question today, but one of the panel members mentioned learning from the past. And I think the concept is great, but how do we learn from the past quicker? It's great to see that policy, funding, and the associated frameworks are now aligning with economic opportunity. But we all know that the pace of change of policy, funding, prioritisation is not necessarily responsive to changing economic opportunity. And therefore, the question is, how do we bring flexibility and agility into funding and policy frameworks so that it is responsive to private sector opportunity? It therefore can deliver infrastructure first, and therefore produce wonderful places and significant economic benefit in the longer term.
It's $1 million question, isn't it?
From my point of view, it's about partnerships and working, for us, working closely with the likes of combined authorities to try, and when an opportunity presents itself, we can quickly manoeuvre. We at the minute, we've got our biggest sort of development ready pipeline, particularly sort of for our industrial and logistics schemes. But the same with residential just means that we can respond to the market much more quickly. And when we have got holes in funding, if there are opportunities that the public sector can plug it, then it's just about working closely.
And I was sort of going to say the same thing, but from the flip, I think it's around that vision and that leadership, and therefore the partnership around how we can work together to do some of that delivery.
It's still very hard though, Adrian.
Yeah.
And speak to the people who've done it before as well. Things are cyclical. There are a lot of people who've been involved in developing new towns. They'll have learned experiences. They will have things to offer. They might have time, and then utilise new technologies to analyse it much more rapidly and share the learning from it.
The New Towns Task Force does set out a lot of good examples from the past, their recommendations to government. So that could be a place to look if you're looking on new towns. I think we're all done for time, aren't we? But if you have any questions, we'll be at the front if you want to come and speak to us directly. Sorry. Is that right? Brilliant. Oh yeah, go on then if we're okay for time. It's a quick one. Sorry.
Well, it was more about the tactical side. Are we being, because we're talking about strategy, but are we not being smart enough tactically? So lots of housing, are we putting employment right next to it, and vice versa? I think, there's 1.5 million homes to be built. That target ain't going to get hit. So we start being realistic and actually put houses where employment centres are, and vice versa, and really start to drive that piece, because that seems to be the missing link.
I think employment and services in itself is another type of infrastructure. We need to be able to get that critical mass with homes and to ensure we have sustainable communities moving forward.
One of our best sites has 2.1 million square feet next to about 3,250 homes, and that is our absolute flagship site. And if we could replicate that across the country, we would do it every day.
We all done? Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon.